Swinburne University of Technology.
Welcome. I'm Josie Arnold, Professor of Writing, and this is for the PhD Training Hub. I have with me today Associate Professor Steve Theiler, and he is a practicing psychologist. He is an academic psychologist, and he does psychology research and also supervises PhD psychology students. Welcome, Steve. Thank you very much for coming on board.
Thanks for having me, Josie.
Now, today we're talking about the psychology PhD and its various structures. So we'll start with perhaps Steve's experience of his own PhD.
Well, that's going back a while now, but my own experience was seeing the PhD at first from more of the positivist view, that this was a science and psychologists looked at the scientific model and that fitted with my thinking at the time. But as time went on, I also thought about the emergence of the narrative sorts of therapies and the not such pure scientific kinds of research. And so I think over time that I've been supervising, and also since I've done my PhD, there's been a shift in emphasis. It's not that the pure sciences and psychology as a pure form has disappeared, but there's been an expansion to integrate, well, as I said, aspects like the narrative therapy, where the student can then look at meaning and areas that aren't so easily measured by an instrument, which would have been originally, when I started anyway, more of an emphasis on those kind of quantitative approaches. Such
as the production of data and the analysis of data, use of statistical information. Is that the kind of thing you're thinking about when you talk about the traditional analytical PhD?
That's right, that's right. And so now what's come in is, if we think of on a dimension, we'd have that on the one side, and then on the other side we'd have a much more interpretivist, phenomenological kind of approach, or as just to name one of them. So that can still be analysed, and you can still look at thematic analysis and interpretations of meaning, but it's quite different from looking at the heavier kind of analysis with statistics that are looking at predictions and causation, those kinds of things.
That's quite exciting and dynamic, isn't it, Steve? And also, in a way, it's arisen from practice and treatment back into the academy, hasn't it? I suppose you're thinking about patient narratives or clients' narratives, so that becomes part of thinking about narrative inquiry, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that there has been those kinds of shifts, and when we think about the early beginnings of psychology with Freud and Jung, and they had a very, in many ways, abstract view of looking at the makeup of personality, the makeup of our psyche. And they were very difficult things to measure. And yet Freud really wanted to have psychology be a science. And in a way there's always been this tension between wanting to become like a science, and yet, you know, the psyche is something that's very difficult, if you like, to measure. With neuroscience and those kinds of developments, it's really opened up a very fascinating area in looking at thinking and what areas of the brain might be affected, which is some other very interesting research. But there's this shift where Freud really wanted psychology to be a science, and yet all his theories and Jung's were really looking at very abstract kinds of constructs. I think we veered towards the more scientific, and in many ways I think now with changes in the types of therapy that are happening, in a way we're swinging back to some of the abstract. And I think that makes it a really exciting development for students as well, because they can look at the quantitative, the measurable, but they can also bring in the the qualitative and the areas that have been more difficult to measure. And to sort of ground that, students now can, for instance, in my case, I did look at the quantitative measures, but I also looked at areas of narrative. So I got people to write about their earliest childhood memories and analyse those, and looked at the links between the narrative in the memory and quantitative measures. So there's also this notion of, rather than going one extreme or the other, or one end of the dimension to the other, we can also have a mixed method. So students can pick up both and be able to incorporate both.
Am I right, Steve, in thinking to become a practicing psychologist you must have a postgraduate degree such as a master's or a PhD?
It's moving that way. We still do have what's called a 4+2 and a 5+1 model. So students can still do the equivalent of a graduate diploma and/or honours, and then do a 2 years practice in the field. Or they can do 5 years with their 5th year being more focused on the psychological practice, and then a further year in a placement setting. So
postgraduate work is really important if you want to become an academic researcher, practicing psychologist.
Yes.
So what sort of thing do you talk about with your students? Do they come to you with a fully formed question, or do you talk to them about that, or how do they come about moving from undergraduate to postgraduate, particularly then to PhD?
Yes, well, that really varies. There's a huge variety of staff here at Swinburne with many different interests, ranging from the more narrative approach right through to neuroimaging and incorporating those aspects, going out to schools, looking at what's important about therapist factors, the qualitative differences that make a good therapist compared to one that doesn't hold their clients. I mean, I could talk for ages about all the different sort of interests that staff have. So students come in sometimes with not really a clear idea. They've got a basis for an area that they'd like to explore further. So they might then look across the many different staff interests and then go and speak with a staff member and say, look, I'm really interested in early childhood memories, or I'm really interested in bipolar disorder, or I'm really interested in helping children at school learn better. And then they would have a conversation with that academic, who would then either shape some of those ideas to match their own, or guide them and give them input into an amalgamation of their ideas plus the experience of the academic.
And there's another thing too that I think all PhD students probably need, which is a writer's voice with some form of style, with some kind of capacity to talk on the page. Do you see that in psychology?
Well, yes, definitely.
And the importance of it?
Yes. I mean, it does come from a tradition with the APA and the APS of having an academic, I mean, there's a manual on how to write for theses.
Yes.
But within those constraints of academic writing, the individual can still come through. And I think that's really important that they do.
And finally, as an ethics question, I guess probably all of your psychology PhDs have to pass some kind of ethics submission, do they?
Yes, they do.
I would imagine.
They do, and that's vitally important, not only for their work as a practicing psychologist, but also in their to be able to run their data collections and publishing in an ethical manner. So yes, they do have training in ethics, and we hold that as being crucial and very important.
Steve, thank you so much for coming with us today and taking us on this short but important journey for PhD and postgraduate students thinking of working in the area of psychology.
This has been a Swinburne production.